I want you to picture something. Picture 2 years of your life, 2 years of late nights, of skipped lunches, of choosing your laptop over your social life because you believed, genuinely believed, that what you were building mattered. 2 years of telling yourself that the grinding, unglamorous work of being thorough, being careful, being right would eventually be recognized. Now, picture standing in a glass-walled conference room while your boss slides a printed document across the table, a document you've never seen before, and says with the most practiced look of disappointment you've ever witnessed, "We found the source of the data breach. It was you." Not a question, a statement. And the document in front of you, it's your work, your research, your methodology, your months of proprietary analysis, dressed up in someone else's formatting, presented under someone else's name, and now being used as the weapon to end your career. Here's what they didn't know. What they couldn't have known, because I hadn't told a single person, was that the version of my research they were holding, the version they had stolen and presented as their own, had a flaw built into it. A small, deliberate, invisible flaw. A poison pill I had planted weeks earlier because I already suspected something wasn't right. They had stolen a trap, and every single word of it was on record. By the time this story ends, the person who engineered my firing would lose their job, face a professional ethics investigation, and become a cautionary tale whispered about in their entire industry. And I would walk away with a settlement, my reputation fully restored, and a career trajectory that frankly wouldn't have happened if none of this had gone wrong. But before we get there, before the satisfaction, you need to understand the full weight of what was done to me. Because this story isn't just about workplace revenge. It's about what happens when someone systematically dismantles your professional identity and what you can do, methodically, legally, and devastatingly effectively, to take it back. Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is where we talk about real workplace experiences, the betrayals, the bureaucracy, and yes, the comebacks. We don't glorify petty drama. We talk about systematic injustice and what it looks like when someone refuses to just quietly disappear. If you have ever poured yourself into a job, trusted the wrong colleague, been blindsided by a firing that felt like a setup, or watched someone else take credit for work that cost you everything to produce, this video is for you. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this. Leave a comment if you've lived something like it. And keep watching because this one goes places you will not expect. Let's start from the beginning. I need to be honest with you about something up front. The job I'm about to describe was not, on the surface, a dream job. It was not a startup with a ping pong table and a kombucha tap. It was not a Fortune 500 company with a glamorous Manhattan address. It was a mid-sized consulting firm. I'll call them Veritas Group because that's not their name and I have a lawyer. So in a mid-sized city, doing mid-sized work for clients who ranged from genuinely important regional companies to municipalities trying to figure out what to do with their aging infrastructure budgets. The work, though, the actual work I was doing, that was interesting. My title was Senior Research Analyst. What that meant in practice was that I was the person who built the proprietary research frameworks that consultants at Veritas used when they went into client engagements. If a team was going into a city's water authority to analyze capital expenditure inefficiencies, I was the one who had designed the diagnostic model they'd be running. If a partner was pitching a regional healthcare network on operational restructuring, the foundational benchmarking data they'd reference in that pitch came through my team. I say my team loosely. At full strength, it was 3 people. Me, a junior analyst named Priya, who had started about 8 months after I did and was genuinely one of the most capable researchers I've ever worked with, and a rotating cast of project-based contractors who came and went depending on workload. We reported to a director of research strategy, and for the first year and a half, that director was a woman named Diane. Diane was the reason I took the job. I had interviewed with her twice, and both times I came away thinking, this is someone who actually understands what rigorous research looks like. She pushed back on my answers. She asked follow-up questions that demonstrated she had read my portfolio. She told me in the second interview, I don't need someone who can follow a template. I need someone who can tell me when the template is wrong. That sentence alone basically sealed the deal for me. Working under Diane was, for the first 14 months of my time at Veritas, genuinely good. She was demanding in the way that good managers are demanding. So high standards, direct feedback, clear expectations. She gave credit openly and publicly. When I built a comparative benchmarking model that saved a client engagement team probably 60 hours of manual data cleaning, she sent an email to the managing partner, copying me and Priya by name, saying, "This is the kind of institutional capability we've been trying to build." I printed that email not because I was paranoid, just because it made me feel good about my choice to be there. And then Diane was promoted. Not pushed out, not fired, genuinely, deservedly promoted into a newly created VP-level role overseeing the entire analytics function across multiple offices. It was a good thing for her. She'd earned it. The problem was her replacement. His name was Marcus Hale. Marcus came in as the new director of research strategy from a competitor firm, one of those hires that gets announced with a lot of fanfare and very little detail. The internal memo described him as a dynamic leader with a track record of scaling research capabilities in high-growth environments, which, in consulting firm language, roughly translates to, "We hired him because he interviewed well and knows people we want to know." I want to be fair here because I think it's important to be fair even about someone who eventually did serious damage to my career. Marcus was not stupid. He was articulate, polished, and extremely good at managing upward. He understood instinctively what senior partners wanted to hear, and he had a gift for packaging complex ideas in simple, confident language. What he was not, and this became clear to me within about 3 weeks of his arrival, was a researcher. He didn't understand the methodologies we used, not at a surface level, not at a deep level. He would sit in on briefings where Priya or I were walking through a framework and ask questions that revealed fundamental misunderstandings of what we were doing, questions that weren't the good kind of challenge the assumption questions, questions that were the kind you ask when you don't know what you don't know. At first, I chalked it up to a learning curve. He was new, the work was specific, give it time. But here's the thing about someone who doesn't understand your work and also doesn't want to admit it: they don't ask you to teach them. They find other ways to compensate. Marcus's other way was to take what we produced and reframe it as his own strategic thinking. The first time I noticed it, I thought I was being uncharitable. He had presented to the managing partner, Roland, on a new capability framework, a way of categorizing our research outputs to make them more usable for different practice areas. It was a good presentation, clean, clear, compelling. It was also almost word for word a document I had submitted to Marcus 2 weeks earlier as a rough internal proposal for restructuring how we organized our deliverables. I pulled up my original email when I got back to my desk. The language was nearly identical. My diagrams, redrawn in a slightly different color scheme. My logic presented as his recommendations. He hadn't mentioned my name once. I told myself, okay, this is a thing that happens in consulting. Ideas travel, structures get absorbed, you contribute to the institutional thinking, and that's part of the job. It doesn't always come with a byline. I told myself that. I almost believed it. Then it happened again and again. And the third time, it wasn't just credit for a document. It was an entire methodology, a research approach I had spent 6 weeks developing for a specific class of public sector engagements, presented to a client by Marcus with full confidence as if he had invented it, while I sat 3 seats down at the same conference table. The client asked a question about the underlying statistical assumptions. Marcus smiled and said, "Great question. I'll have my team pull together a more detailed technical appendix." His team. I was his team. After that meeting, Priya caught up to me in the hallway. She didn't say anything for a second. Then she said quietly, "Is it just me, or does he not actually know how any of this works?" It was not just her. The credit stealing was the most visible problem, but it wasn't the only one. There were other signs that Marcus was going to be trouble. Signs I cataloged later, but at the time registered only as low-grade professional discomfort. He was inconsistent in private versus public. In one-on-ones, Marcus would frequently tell me my work was excellent and that he was genuinely impressed by what our team was building. These were not the words of someone who planned to undermine me. They were the words of someone who needed me to keep producing work he could take credit for, and who understood that I would do that better if I felt valued. But in group settings, particularly in any room where senior partners were present, Marcus had a habit of subtly positioning himself as the source of our team's insights. He would say things like, "The framework we've been developing," or "the approach I've been piloting with the research team," in ways that were technically inclusive but functionally implied ownership. He also had a particular problem with documentation. Marcus hated written records of process. He would call meetings instead of sending emails. He preferred verbal feedback to written notes. When I started following up our phone conversations with summary emails, just to make sure I've captured this correctly, he would often reply with a brief, slightly annoyed, looks fine that told me he understood exactly what I was doing and didn't love it. But I kept doing it, not because I was paranoid, because I was organized. That habit, that compulsive documentation habit, was going to save my career. And then something happened that changed everything. About 18 months into my time at Veritas, and roughly 4 months into Marcus's tenure, we landed a significant new engagement. I'll call it the Ridgeline Project. A large regional utility company was looking to modernize its asset management strategy, and Veritas had won the engagement on the back of, among other things, a capabilities presentation that featured methodology I had built. The Ridgeline project was high profile internally. It had the attention of 3 managing partners. It had a dedicated team of 7 consultants, and it had a research component, a deep dive benchmarking and risk analysis framework that was going to be entirely handled by our team. Marcus was the point person for research delivery, which meant he was the one in the room with partners and clients. I was the one building the engine. For the next 8 weeks, I worked harder than I had since graduate school. I'm not exaggerating. I was putting in 12 13-hour days. I restructured our entire benchmarking database to support the specific variables the Ridgeline analysis required. I built a predictive risk scoring model from scratch that the engagement team could use to prioritize asset replacement recommendations. I wrote a 50-page technical appendix that explained every assumption, every data source, every methodological choice we made. Priya was my right hand through all of it. She handled data ingestion and quality control with a precision that made my work cleaner than it would have been alone. We were a good team. Marcus, in those 8 weeks, contributed 2 things: a slide that reformatted our executive summary, and a request that I simplify the language in a section he clearly didn't understand. When the Ridgeline research deliverable was presented to the client, a presentation I attended as a support resource, Marcus received a standing ovation, literally. The CFO of the utility stood up and called it the most rigorous independent analysis we've ever been presented. The managing partner, Roland, looked at Marcus with the expression of a man watching his investment pay off. I sat in the 3rd row and clapped. Afterward, Roland stopped Marcus in the hallway and shook his hand. "Outstanding work, Marcus. Outstanding." Marcus said, "We have a phenomenal team." He did not gesture toward me. He did not say my name. He did not say Priya's name. Roland nodded and moved on. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Not crying, not angry, exactly, just recalibrating, trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. Was I being naive about how these organizations work? Was I wrong to expect acknowledgement? Was this just the price of being a behind-the-scenes contributor in a client-facing industry? I called my friend Terrence, who had been through his own workplace nightmare a few years earlier and had the battle scars to prove it. He listened to me for about 10 minutes and then said, "You need to start protecting yourself. Right now, not because you're planning to do anything, but because people like this don't stop until they have something to lose." I didn't fully understand what he meant yet. After Ridgeline delivered, Marcus's star inside Veritas rose fast. He started being included in partner-level strategy conversations. He was appointed to an internal innovation council that was basically a prestige committee for people the firm was grooming for leadership. Roland mentioned him by name in an all-staff email. And as Marcus's profile rose, something shifted in how he treated me. It was subtle at first. He started being less responsive to my check-ins. Feedback on my work, which had previously been prompt even if superficial, started taking days. When I flagged potential issues, a data source that had changed its methodology, a benchmarking variable that I thought needed re-examination, he would respond with noted or not at all. Then, about 2 months after Ridgeline, he started questioning my competence. Not directly, never directly. That's not how people like Marcus operate. It started with an offhand comment in a team meeting. "I want to make sure our quality control processes are tighter going forward. I've noticed some inconsistencies in recent deliverables." And he didn't cite examples. He didn't point to anything specific. But the comment was made in front of Priya and 2 project-based contractors, and he looked at me when he said it. A week later, he mentioned to Roland, I found this out later, that he was concerned about the rigor of some of the research team's outputs, and was working to address some process gaps. Then came the performance review. I had never in my entire career received a negative performance review. I want to be clear about that, not out of arrogance, but because it's relevant context. Diane had given me strong reviews both cycles I worked under her. My client feedback had been consistently positive. My review under Marcus was devastating. He gave me meets expectations across the board, down from the exceeds expectations I'd received previously, and included written comments that described me as resistant to feedback, siloed in my approach, and at times a disruptive force on cross-functional teams. I read those words 3 times. Then I read them again. These weren't criticisms that had evolved from discussions or documented concerns. They appeared fully formed in an official review signed by my manager. I requested a meeting to discuss the review. Marcus was pleasant, professional, and completely unmovable. He said he hoped we could work through this together. He said he valued my contributions, but that there was room for growth. He said HR would likely want to do a check-in. I walked out of that meeting with a very specific, very cold feeling in my stomach. Not panic, something more like recognition. This is what the beginning of a setup looks like. Here's where things get complicated, and where some of what I'm about to describe is going to sound, in retrospect, almost too calculated, but here's the truth. At the point I started taking the actions I'm about to describe, I was not certain of anything. I was operating on professional instinct and the advice of Terrence, who kept telling me, document, document, document. What I knew concretely was this. My work was consistently being presented externally without attribution. My performance review contained criticisms that had never been raised with me previously and that I believed were fabricated. And Marcus had begun positioning himself as concerned about my performance to senior leadership before ever discussing those concerns with me directly. These 3 things, taken together, told me I needed to start protecting myself actively, not reactively, actively. I took 4 steps. Step 1, I went back through every email, every document, every calendar invite from the previous 18 months and began organizing them into a chronological record. I stored copies in 3 places: my personal cloud storage, an external drive, and a printed binder I kept at home. Step 2, I began sending end-of-week summary emails to Marcus, not accusatory emails, just brief professional notes. Here's a summary of what the research team completed this week, key deliverables, and what we're planning for next week. Professional, innocuous, and creating a paper trail of my output that was time-stamped and went directly to my manager's inbox. Step 3, I reached out quietly to Diane. She was now a VP, and while our working relationship had changed, she still respected my work. I told her I was finding the transition to working under Marcus an adjustment and asked if she had any advice. She paused before answering, which told me more than her words did. She said, "Keep doing excellent work and make sure people can see it's yours." And then she said, "And document everything." That was the second time someone had told me to document everything in as many months. Step 4, this is the one I need to explain carefully because it's the one that became the center of everything. I had become increasingly certain, not based on paranoia, but based on pattern recognition, that Marcus was not just taking credit for work conceptually. I believed he was lifting actual documents, actual frameworks, actual written analysis that I produced and presenting them or sharing them outside the firm as if they were his own intellectual work product. I didn't have proof, I had circumstantial evidence. A client had once referenced a model that matched something I'd built, but that I hadn't been in the room to present. A competitor firm, where Marcus had worked previously, had published a white paper with a framework that bore a striking structural resemblance to a proprietary model I had developed 18 months earlier. Could be coincidence, could be parallel thinking, could be Marcus. To find out, I did something I had read about in the context of leak detection and intellectual property protection. I created what's sometimes called a canary document, or a honeypot. The concept is simple. If you suspect someone is stealing a specific document, you give them a version that contains a subtle, unique error, an error specific enough that if it shows up somewhere else, you know exactly where it came from. I built a version of my current flagship research framework that contained one deliberate, carefully designed methodological flaw. It wasn't obvious. It wouldn't produce obviously wrong results. But it was specific enough that any expert in the field reviewing the output would eventually catch it. And I would know with absolute certainty where it came from. I submitted this version to Marcus through our standard internal document sharing system. The same way I submitted everything. As far as he knew, it was the current working draft. The real version without the flaw, I kept on my personal encrypted drive. I told no one, not Priya, not Terrence, not Diane. I dated the original. I created a digital fingerprint of the file that would prove it predated anything else. I saved the metadata. And then I waited. And then something happened that changed everything. It was a Thursday, 2 weeks after I had submitted the canary document to Marcus, when I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was, "Question about benchmarking methodology." The email was from a researcher at a university policy research center. He introduced himself and explained that his team had recently reviewed a consulting white paper that had been shared at an industry convening, a regional infrastructure policy conference that I had not attended, and that they had some questions about the statistical methodology used in the asset risk scoring section. He wanted to understand the basis for a specific assumption in the risk model. He included a quoted passage from the paper. I read the quoted passage and felt the blood leave my face. It was from my document. Nearly verbatim. Presented in a white paper distributed under a different organization's name, a policy consulting group I had never heard of, at a conference I had not attended, for which I had received no invitation. The flaw I had deliberately built into the canary document was in the quoted passage. I sat very still for a long time. Then I responded to the researcher, calmly, professionally, thanking him for reaching out and asking if he could share the full paper with me for context. He sent it within the hour. The white paper was 11 pages. It drew heavily, in places almost entirely, from the framework I had built. The organization listed as the author was a think tank style entity I couldn't find much about online. There was no author listed on the paper. But the acknowledgement section thanked, among others, Marcus Hale, Director of Research Strategy, Veritas Group, for his ongoing thought partnership. I closed my laptop, I got up, I walked around my apartment for about 5 minutes, I made coffee I didn't drink, I sat back down. Then I started working. Let me be direct about something. At this point, I had evidence. Real, documentable, legally meaningful evidence. But evidence is not the same as a case, and a case is not the same as a win. What I needed to do was build something airtight, something that could not be dismissed, minimized, or explained away. First, I consulted an employment attorney. I want to be very clear, I did this before I did anything else inside my organization. Before I went to HR, before I confronted anyone, before I sent a single additional email. This is the most important thing I can tell anyone in a workplace dispute. Talk to a lawyer first, not after you've already made moves. Before. The attorney, a woman named Carolyn who specialized in employment law and intellectual property matters, was recommended to me by a friend. Our first consultation lasted 90 minutes. I walked her through everything. She identified at least 3 potential legal theories: misappropriation of trade secrets, breach of employment duty, and, depending on what we found, potentially fraud, since using someone else's intellectual work to build personal business relationships outside your employer is not just ethically wrong, it may cross legal lines. She also told me something that reframed how I was thinking about this. Right now, she said, you have enough to protect yourself. You may not yet have enough to go on offense. Let's focus on making sure that when they inevitably come after you, and I think they will, you're in an impossible position to lose. She was right. They came after me 2 weeks later. Second, I built a timeline, a master chronological document. Every piece of evidence, every date, every deliverable, every email, every meeting note. I identified the canary document and provided the digital fingerprint proving its creation date. I printed the white paper and annotated it side by side against my original framework. Carolyn flagged something I had missed. The conference where the white paper was distributed had a published attendee list. Marcus had attended. As an individual summit, not representing Veritas Group, that detail was legally significant. It suggested he was building something outside Veritas, potentially competing, using intellectual property that belonged to the firm. This changed the nature of the case. Third, I made a confidential disclosure to Diane, not through official channels yet. A direct, private conversation. I met her for coffee off-site and laid it out. I have evidence that Marcus has been distributing proprietary firm research externally under circumstances that don't appear to be authorized by Veritas, and I have a documented connection between that external distribution and work product that can be traced directly to me. Diane went very still. She asked me 2 questions. Have you talked to anyone else about this? And do you have a lawyer? I said yes to both. She said, give me 48 hours. Don't do anything until you hear from me. Fourth, I prepared for the counterattack because when people like Marcus feel threatened, even before they know they're actually under investigation, they act. Some instinct triggers, they preempt. Carolyn warned me. Before this resolves in your favor, it's likely to get worse first. She was right. 4 days after my conversation with Diane, Marcus called me into his office. He told me he had continuing concerns about my performance. He told me he was going to recommend a performance improvement plan, a PP, effective immediately. The same vague criticisms, resistance to feedback, siloed working, cross-functional friction. I took notes. I kept my face neutral. I said, I'd like everything in writing, please. He looked at me for just a half-second longer than was natural. Of course, he said. I walked out of his office and texted Carolyn one word, PIP. She responded, perfect, don't sign anything. Here is where I needed to introduce someone I haven't mentioned yet. Fletcher, one of Veritas's 3 managing partners. Fletcher oversaw research and innovation, which made him the person ultimately responsible for the integrity of our intellectual property. He was also a former academic who had published his own peer-reviewed research and had strong views about attribution and intellectual honesty. Diane, in those 48 hours, had gone to Fletcher. She had told him enough that she had received information suggesting potentially serious unauthorized external disclosure of proprietary firm research, and that the person who brought it to her had documented evidence. Fletcher had not been happy. Fletcher had also been aware of the white paper. A junior consultant named Devin, who had attended the conference in a firm capacity, had received a copy at a panel session, noticed it looked familiar, and had mentioned it in passing to a partner, who had filed it mentally and not acted on it. Devin's mention was now suddenly very actionable. Carolyn advised me that the strongest position was to present my evidence through official channels, a formal disclosure to HR with legal counsel copied, and to let the firm's own self-interest work in my direction. Veritas had enormous incentive to take this seriously. Their proprietary research was their core product. The PIP was scheduled to formally begin Monday. On Friday afternoon, Carolyn filed a formal written disclosure on my behalf with Veritas HR, copied to Fletcher's office. The PIP was never implemented. And then something happened that changed everything. What I had not anticipated, what even Carolyn had not fully anticipated, was that Marcus would panic, and that his panic would cause him to do something so reckless, so operationally stupid, that it transformed a complicated situation into something almost comically clear-cut. Here's what he did. On Saturday morning, 2 days after our formal disclosure was filed, Marcus sent an email to Roland with the subject line, Urgent, Research Team Data Breach. In the email, he claimed that I had been leaking proprietary Veritas research externally. He said he had discovered that the white paper circulated at the infrastructure conference contained firm data, and that his preliminary investigation suggested I was the source. He said he believed this was connected to my documented performance issues and was clearly retaliatory in nature. Retaliation, he claimed, against his effort to address my performance. He attached a document to the email. The document he attached was a copy of the white paper. And here's the thing, and here is the beautiful, catastrophic, career-ending thing. The document he attached was the version of the white paper that contained the flawed assumption from my canary document. He attached as evidence against me the document that contained my planted flaw, and in attaching it, he proved beyond any rational doubt that he had access to the version of my research that contained that flaw, a version I had submitted only to him through our internal system, a version that had never been publicly distributed. A version whose contents could only have been accessed by someone who had received that specific file from me. In trying to blame me for the leak, he proved he was the leak. Carolyn, when I called her Sunday morning, actually laughed. He has just handed us everything, she said. Everything. Monday morning, Marcus was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Veritas moved fast. When a firm's managing partners conclude that a director-level employee may have been distributing proprietary research to outside entities, potentially entities he was personally affiliated with, the institutional impulse towards self-protection kicks in immediately. Fletcher brought in an outside firm to conduct the investigation. Independent, not Veritas's internal team. The investigation lasted 6 weeks. I cooperated fully. I provided everything: my original documents with metadata, the digital fingerprint of the Canary framework, the email exchange with the university researcher who had first alerted me to the white paper, my weekly summary emails to Marcus, my chronological documentation going back 18 months. Priya had been keeping her own records, not as a formal strategy, just because she was meticulous. She had her own contemporaneous notes of meetings where Marcus had presented our work as his, dates and specifics that corroborated my account independently. Devin provided a written statement confirming when and where he'd seen the white paper and that he had received it from a conference materials packet where it was not attributed to Veritas. The investigation found Marcus had, on at least 4 occasions over a 12-month period, shared substantial portions of proprietary Veritas research externally through the entity behind the white paper without authorization. The entity in question appeared to be a consulting entity in early formation stages that Marcus had personal financial connections to, connections he had not disclosed to Veritas in violation of his employment contract's conflict of interest provisions. The performance criticisms Marcus had leveled against me were not supported by any contemporaneous documentation, client feedback, or corroborating accounts from colleagues. The investigators noted this directly in their findings, and Marcus's email to Roland accusing me of the breach, sent the day after a formal legal disclosure was filed against him, was interpreted by the investigators as likely retaliatory. Marcus was terminated, effective immediately for cause. Within a week of Marcus's termination, Roland asked to meet with me directly. He was formal but direct. He acknowledged unambiguously that I had been subjected to a clear attempt to both appropriate my work and damage my professional standing. He told me the firm considered that to be serious misconduct and took responsibility for the fact that it had occurred under their oversight. He told me my performance review was being formally expunged from my record. He told me my role would be reclassified, a reclassification that came with a meaningful title change and salary adjustment. His lawyer had a separate conversation with Carolyn. I'm not going to get into numbers. What I can say is that Carolyn told me when it was done that it was fair and then some, which is the most positive language I have ever heard her use about anything. But here's what mattered more to me than the money. Veritas sent a letter on firm letterhead signed by Fletcher to the university researcher who had first contacted me about the white paper. The letter explained that the research in question was the original work of a Veritas research team led by me, that it had been distributed externally without authorization, and that the firm was taking corrective action. The researcher wrote back to me personally. He said he had cited the white paper in one preliminary draft and had now corrected the attribution. He said he was sorry I had dealt with this and he hoped I was doing okay. That email made me feel something I hadn't felt in months. Something close to relief. Here is the part of the story I haven't told you yet, the part that even I didn't fully understand until about 4 months after Marcus was terminated. The unauthorized entity Marcus had been building had been in contact with several other Veritas employees. Marcus hadn't been working alone. One of those employees had provided Marcus with secondhand accounts of supposed team friction involving me, accounts that turned out to be fabricated or grossly distorted. That person was one of the rotating contractors, someone I had generally thought of as pleasant and professionally competent, who had been feeding Marcus talking points and was apparently promised a role in the outside entity. That person was also let go. I sat with that information for a long time. It's one thing to have a bad manager. It's another thing to realize that while you were working 12-hour days and trusting your team, someone in the next chair over was documenting your habits for the person trying to get you fired. I bring this up because I think it's important to be realistic about workplace betrayal. It isn't always one villain. Sometimes there's a whole small ecosystem of people whose interests become aligned against yours. And the sooner you accept that the landscape can be more complicated than you initially believe, the better protected you'll be. But here's the other side of that. When it all came out, the response from the people in my corner was also bigger than I expected. Diane personally advocated for my reclassification. Roland made public inside the firm that the research capability Veritas was known for was mine. Devin, unprompted, mentioned my name in a client presentation as the architect of the methodology we were using. Priya was promoted. She earned it. I told HR exactly that. 6 months after Marcus's termination, I left Veritas Group. Not because I was pushed out, because I was recruited. Hard. Diane introduced me to a senior partner at a different firm who had heard through professional channels that Veritas had a researcher with an unusual combination of technical rigor and strategic thinking. I had a first conversation that turned into 3 more conversations that turned into an offer. The role was head of research innovation, a leadership title, a budget, a team I would actually build and own, in every sense, a compensation package that represented a 40% increase over what I'd been making. I accepted it. My last day at Veritas was a Friday afternoon in autumn. Roland shook my hand. Diane hugged me. Priya cried slightly and pretended she wasn't. Devin brought a cake that said, and I am not making this up, the architect on it. I ate 2 slices. I drove home with the window down and the kind of exhausted, complete feeling you get when a long, difficult thing is finally actually over. Not happy, exactly, not sad, just arrived, like I had been traveling somewhere difficult for a very long time and had finally gotten there. I thought about the night 2 years earlier when Marcus first presented my work as his own to Roland in that conference room. I had sat in a chair and clapped for him. I had told myself it was fine. I had swallowed something that should not have been swallowed. I was glad I had stopped swallowing it. I was glad I had started documenting. I was glad that 2 years of methodical, boring, painstaking work had built something sturdy enough that when someone tried to demolish it, they couldn't. They couldn't because I knew where every brick was. I've been doing a lot of thinking in the months since all of this resolved about what I actually want people to hear when I tell this story. Here's what I actually want you to know. Documentation is not paranoia, it is professionalism. The single most important thing I did was maintaining contemporaneous records of my own work and my own contributions. The emails I sent recapping meetings, the weekly summaries, the dated files, the digital fingerprint of my original documents, none of that was dramatic. None of it felt like strategy in the moment. It was boring, meticulous professional habit. And it saved me. If you work in an environment where your contributions might ever be questioned, document. Not obsessively, not with paranoia, just cleanly and consistently. Know your legal rights before you need them. I cannot tell you how many people go through workplace disputes without consulting an employment attorney until they've already taken actions that have narrowed their options. An initial consultation with an employment lawyer is often surprisingly affordable. Many offer free initial consultations. Know what a PAP is and what rights you have when one is proposed. Know the difference between a performance issue and a documentation pattern being built to support a predetermined outcome. The people who tell you to just let it go are not the ones who have to live with the consequences. I understand the impulse behind that advice. Sometimes moving on is genuinely the right call. But there is a difference between choosing strategically not to fight and being told you have no right to fight at all. What was done to me was deliberate, sustained, documented misconduct. Letting it go would not have made me safer. It would have left Marcus free to do the same thing to Priya or to whoever came after me. Sometimes the most professional thing you can do is refuse to pretend that what happened didn't happen. And finally, trust the slow work. This resolution did not happen because I made a dramatic move. It happened because I had spent 18 months doing my work carefully, documenting it clearly, maintaining my professional relationships honestly, and when the moment came, having enough built up that the truth was easier to see than to ignore. The canary document was clever, but it worked because it was planted in a foundation of credible, documented, verifiable professional behavior. A trap without credibility is just a stunt. If you're in the middle of something like this right now, if you're doing good work in an environment that doesn't seem to see it, if you're watching someone else take credit for what cost you everything to produce, keep building, keep documenting, keep doing the work at the standard you know it deserves. The work is the thing that outlasts the people who try to take it from you. Priya is now a research director at her own firm. She manages a team of 6. When she told me about the promotion, she said, I kept thinking about what you said, that the goal is to build something that's yours in a way that survives what happens to it. I don't remember saying that, but I'm glad I apparently did. If you've made it this far, thank you. That means something to me. If you have a story like this one, or if you're in the middle of one right now, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. Tell me what happened or what's happening. Tell me what step you're on. I read every single one. If this story helped you think through something you're dealing with, share it with someone who needs it. That's the whole reason I put this together. And subscribe if you want more. We do this every single week. Take care of yourself. Document everything. I'll see you in the next one.